Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, May 9th, Friday Eve, we like to call it here on the podcast. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast, of course. This is mo.news.
And this is Jill Wagner, and this is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. I was talking to Jill just before the pod as to whether we should take some hallucinogens before one of these episodes and see how it impacts the stories we choose and our delivery.
And I said, how do you know that I haven't done that already?
For those of you listening to this being like, what are they even talking about? What we're talking about here is the commencement speech from Ohio State. You might have seen this thing go viral. Chris Pan is his name. He's a motivational speaker. He's an alum of Ohio State. He apparently, in the process of writing his speech, he did a bunch of hallucinogens, including ayahuasca, as he wrote this speech that ultimately included a sing-along, a magic trick, some motivational words, a discussion of Bitcoin and some finance. Anyway, it's gotten a lot of attention. We actually had Chris on for an Instagram Live yesterday on the Mo News account. And so that's the backstory here. We're not actually seriously considering this, I don't think yet, Jill. But given that Chris took some as he wrote his commencement speech, we were just wondering what it would do for this podcast.
And maybe on a light news day.
you know, by the way, like somehow we'd be like, oh, we should take a hallucinogen and like something huge would happen. And I'll be like, this is not a good look, Mosh. Not a good look.
And we will have plenty more on that speech at the end of this podcast. Now to the headlines. Are Donald Trump's legal troubles behind him? Some decisions this week mean that Trump could make it to the November election without facing the most serious charges against him. To the Middle East, the U.S. pauses an arms shipment to Israel, what the U.S. Defense Secretary says is the reason. Severe weather around the globe, from flooding in Brazil to tornadoes in Michigan. Meanwhile, the world just passed a major clean energy milestone. We'll tell you about it. One of the more bizarre stories in politics this week, presidential candidate R.F.K. Jr. says that doctors found a dead worm in his brain. We'll explain.
New fear unlocked, Jill.
Is it a boom time for trains? Some say it is. And again, Moshe talks to that Ohio State commencement speaker.
We'll talk about intentionality, facing your critics, and just the whole nature of commencement speeches these days, Jill.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, one of your favorite singers has a big birthday today.
It's like Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, the Lumineers. For some reason, you think I love Madonna. I don't hate Madonna. You like Madonna. I like Madonna. All
right, we'll have the answer to that and on this day in history.
Okay, let's start with Donald Trump's legal troubles, which Moshe, as time goes on, appear to me not so troubling. He started this year potentially facing about 90-something criminal charges and 4 criminal trials as he runs for president, all of which could lead to potential prison time. His strategy throughout has been delay, at least until after this year's election. That's because if he wins in November, he could shut down the 2 federal cases, and the state cases in New York and Georgia also might have to be frozen. And so after some developments in the last week, it is looking like this is turning into an ideal legal scenario for Donald Trump.
To put it in poker terms, he might have actually drawn an inside straight here.
As someone who does not understand poker, I'm not totally sure what you mean.
It's a good thing. It's a very good thing, Jill.
It does sound good. Okay, so let's take a look at where things stand. It now looks like he's going to face only one trial, that hush money trial that's currently underway in New York City that we've been telling you about, which arguably is the weakest of all 4 cases. A jury could rule on that trial by June. But again, it isn't the strongest case, and it's one that even some Democrats say never really should have been brought in the first place. But the other 3 may now not happen until 2025 or ever.
Yeah, let's talk about those other 3. Let's go one by one here. There's the 2 federal cases, the classified records at Mar-a-Lago and election interference, and then the separate election interference case in Georgia. That's where a major development happened yesterday. A Georgia appeals court has agreed to an appeal by Trump and his team to review a ruling from earlier this spring questioning whether Fani Willis, the DA, should be allowed to prosecute him at all. Now, you might remember that Trump and some other defendants have been trying to get Willis removed from the case. They argued that her romantic relationship with the prosecutor she hired created a conflict of interest. A judge agreed, and that judge in March said, well, as long as Nathan Wade, that's the prosecutor / romantic interests of Fani Willis, as long as he resigned, that he was gone, the trial could proceed. Well, Trump and company decided to appeal that. They're like, no, we don't want just Wade gone. We think Willis should be gone. We think that she's unethical, and this creates an issue. And so now you have an appeals court in Georgia that says, you know what, we're going to look into that. We should see whether Willis should also go here due to her behavior, due to ethical concerns. What does that mean? Well, this appeals court now has until November to decide whether Willis should be with the case. What that means is the case itself is frozen until at least November. So you had this huge unforced error here by Fani. She brings in Wade. They engage in their relationship. There are questions about ethics there, a whole bunch of issues. Again, not about the underlying charges against Trump, but again, the conduct here of Willis. So the appeals court has to decide that. Then they can hear the underlying case, which means Georgia, which we thought was going to happen this year, ain't happening for Trump. And then, Jill, there are the two federal indictments.
So, right, the classified documents trial in Florida, which some have said is the strongest case against Trump, and it's the one that deals directly with national security. That trial was originally scheduled for May 20th. Now the judge, Aileen Cannon, who was a Trump appointee, has indefinitely postponed the trial. If you remember, he's been indicted on charges that he hoarded hundreds of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago after his presidency. He is accused of hiding them and then refusing to give them back to the federal government, to the point that the FBI actually had to conduct a raid to get them back. Special counsel Jack Smith had urged Cannon to schedule the trial to start in July. But this week, an order from the judge suggested she is unlikely to even decide on a new trial date before late July. Smith has been criticizing her for dragging her feet. Cannon seems to indicate that she wants to resolve a backlog of issues that are involved in the case before she sets a trial date.
Yeah, as far as this case is concerned, we always knew this was going to be complicated, right? We're dealing with top secret documents, classified documents. How will the jury look at them? How will we deal with them? I mean, they deal with potentially nuclear secrets, etc. that, again, Trump took back to Mar-a-Lago with him. Now, Judge Cannon has no experience dealing with these types of cases. She's a brand new federal judge. So while over the last few months she has ended up ruling in favor of Jack Smith, there's all these motions being thrown at her by Trump and his team as part of this delay tactic. And she's like, well, I got to consider that. I got to consider that. And it's taking a long time here. And this is why it was actually one of the good moves by Trump to get this trial in Florida, because the DC courts are very used to dealing with top secret documents and national security trials. Florida is not. So Cannon here trying to navigate all the rules related to classified documents. So that means that case is pushed back for a while. So that's federal case. That's case number 3 here. So we call Stormy Daniels 1. We call Georgia 2. We got classified 3. Now number 4. The federal election interference case regarding January 6th and the various efforts made by Trump and his team to overturn the election, Jack Smith says illegally. Well, this is the case where Trump has been pushing the idea that he has immunity for life, that once he's president, you can't be prosecuted for anything you do as president. That is a case that has been taken to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to rule on it when? Late June, early July. Once they rule on it, then it goes back to the judge considering that, and then they got to go ahead and schedule a trial there. That is, of course, if there are not other potential motions, which you can imagine there will be, by the Trump team in regards to immunity and other matters relating the election interference. So to recap here, you got Stormy happening. You'll probably see a verdict there in the next few weeks. You got Georgia delayed. You got classified records delayed. And you got federal election interference delayed. And notably, Jill, the 2 federal trials, as you mentioned, classified and federal election interference, well, they're federal. They were brought by the Department of Justice. If Trump is elected in November again, who runs the Department of Justice? President Trump. Well, what is one of the things he's probably going to do first? New Attorney General, please kill those 2 federal cases against Trump. And so those go away. And then, as you mentioned, the state cases, typically they don't want prosecutions against sitting presidents. So that could, completely kill the Georgia case as well.
Okay, now to some extreme weather. Starting in Brazil, rescuers rushed to evacuate people that were stranded by devastating floods across the southern Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul this week. At least 90 people have died. Thousands have been left homeless and are in need of basic supplies and just food and water. About 131 people are still unaccounted for. The heavy rains that started last week have caused rivers to flood, destroying roads and bridges. And the storms have affected more than 1 million people in 385 different areas.
Yeah, Jill, this is a very large expanse. You're talking about tens of millions of people impacted here. Airports underwater, really remarkable pictures and video coming in of rescues as well. Now, the rain is expected to slow today, but then it comes back on Thursday. And this is, as we've been telling you, that, as we go through the El Nino phenomenon, as it transitions to La Nina, which we see every few years in the Pacific, that tends to bring big rainfall to southern Brazil, but then add to that the impact of climate change, which they believe has exacerbated extreme weather in the region.
And then a bit closer to home, there were severe storms that barreled through the Midwest early Wednesday. And that's a day after 2 reported tornadoes struck a Michigan city and surrounding area. They destroyed homes and commercial buildings, including a FedEx facility. In Michigan, there are no reported injuries, and it's something that the National Weather Service is crediting to early warnings, a meteorologist saying that the warnings went out and people reacted to them.
Yeah, so right now we're in the busiest, most active time for tornadoes. It typically lasts between April to June, May being the busiest month, though. Now these days we do see them year-round. There's been at least 1 tornado reported in the U.S. every day since April 25th, so a streak now lasts a couple of weeks, more than 300 reports. Jill, we talked about this on the Instagram account. The U.S. has the most tornadoes in the world by far, about 1,200 a year, more than Europe, Canada, most other countries combined. It's part of the reason is our geography, the way that storms come over the Rocky Mountains into the plains, which is a flat area, with warm moisture coming from the Gulf of Mexico. And basically, it's sort of this perfect situation to create so many tornadoes. So as you mentioned, we saw them in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri. There's a deadly one in Oklahoma. There's also a death in Tennessee in the past day. Much of the South is under tornado warnings today between Texas and the Carolinas. So be on the lookout there. And it has come as in recent decades, you have seen Tornado Alley move from what was Kansas, Nebraska, sort of the old Wizard of Oz, Tornado Alley. Now, because of the way climate change is happening, we are seeing much more in the way of tornadoes in the deep South, in the Alabamas and Mississippis, than you would have seen 40 or 50 years ago.
Okay, now to some potentially positive climate news.
Yeah, we need that. Let's go there.
Growth in wind and solar meant a record-breaking 30% of the world's electricity was produced by renewables last year. That's according to some new data. And it is a significant step toward the world reaching 60% renewable electricity by 2030 under an agreement that was struck by more than 100 countries at the UN's COP28 climate summit last year. In 2000, renewables made up less than 19% of the global energy mix. Taking nuclear energy into account, the world generated almost 40% of its electricity from low-carbon sources last year.
Yeah, this is a big deal because the more renewables we are getting energy from, the less CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere, which means slowly but surely slowing the amount of CO2 that goes in and that impacts climate change. Now, when you break down the numbers here, some interesting data, more than half of the global additions when it comes to solar and wind capacity came from China in the last year, with total global solar generation now up to 23%, wind up to about 10%. China is key because they are the biggest polluter in the world, though when you consider it per capita, per population, we here in the U.S. continue to be the biggest polluter by person in the world. So cutting fossil fuels will be key here as the world tries to slowly but surely meet its emissions targets. And it comes, Jill, as I had a conversation recently on the Mo.news interview podcast with Bill Weir, the chief climate correspondent at CNN, who was talking about how it's become economically better to do clean energy, as in it is cheaper to have clean energy than dirty energy. So one notable thing we learned in his book, and we talk about in the conversation over on the Mo.news interview pod, is how Texas, of all places, leads the country now here in the U.S. in clean energy production. many days, the majority of power coming to Texans is coming from clean energy, despite, of course, that they're also still drilling for oil, et cetera, in the state as well.
I was going to say, shh, don't tell anybody. It's like Biden, who doesn't want to broadcast that the U.S. is now producing more oil than it ever has in history.
The world record in history in oil, but he doesn't want his people to know that. And I would imagine Governor Abbott and others are like, shh, clean energy is for a bunch of wokesters. But the interesting thing is you've gotten to the point now where clean energy, again, is cheaper. It makes more economic sense than natural gas, oil, and coal in some cases. So ultimately, the market will drive this. And that's a huge, huge step forward here as we try to gradually transition the energy economy.
All right, time now for the speed read from Bloomberg. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says the U.S. has paused the supply of high payload munitions to Israel over concerns about a potential military offensive in the Gazan city of Rafah. The delivery was supposed to contain 3,500 bombs, split roughly evenly between 2,000-pound and 500-pound explosives. This is according to a senior administration official. Here is Austin speaking to a Senate appropriations panel.
As we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions. And again, I think we've also been very clear about the steps that we'd like to see Israel take to account for and take care of those civilians before major combat takes place. We certainly would like to see no major combat take place in Rafah.
This appears to be the first time the administration has delayed a potential weapons sale for Israel since the Hamas attack on October 7th. And it speaks to the growing tension between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Joe Biden, who has voiced opposition to an attack on Rafah and reaffirmed that message in a call between the leaders on Monday.
Yeah, it also speaks to the domestic political situation here in the U.S., where the Biden administration, needs to show progressives on the left and critics within the Democratic Party of the support for Israel that he's doing something. So the aid was passed. Weapons are going to Israel, but they're holding off on these larger bombs for now, temporarily, according to Austin. No final decision has been made as far as they're concerned. Privately, Israeli officials have expressed frustration here and warned the U.S. that this could jeopardize ceasefire talks. Also, the Israelis point out that these are precision-guided weapons. So if the U.S. is looking to limit casualties, civilian casualties, Israel could use these much more precise weapons than some of the other weapons that they have still in their arsenal. So one of the ironies here that some folks on the Israeli side will point out. They've told U.S. officials that pressure needs to be put on Hamas here to sign the ceasefire deal. And you did hear some pushback at the hearing, Jill, on Wednesday, where Defense Secretary Austin was going up against a number of senators, some of whom on the Republican side were saying this sends the wrong message to Iranian-backed groups, that the U.S. is willing to withhold weaponry and that this will only embolden them. Here's a bit of Senator Lindsey Graham expressing frustration with Lloyd Austin.
Israel's been hit in the last few weeks by Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, dedicated to their destruction. And you're telling me you're going to tell them how to fight the war and what they can and can't use when everybody around them wants to kill all the Jews? And you're telling me that if we withhold weapons in this fight, the existential fight for the life of the Jewish state, it won't send the wrong signal? Do you still think it was a good idea, General Austin, to get out of Afghanistan?
I support the president's decision.
Yeah, I think you do. I think it was a disastrous decision. If we stop weapons necessary to destroy the enemies of the state of Israel at a time of great peril, we will pay a price. This is obscene. It is absurd. Give Israel what they need to fight the war they can't afford to lose. This is Hiroshima and Nagasaki on steroids.
You heard the reference there to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Graham was pushing Austin, saying, in World War II, would you have approved the use of the atom bomb there? Ultimately, the argument being that, that Hamas, that the enemy needs to be vanquished, like in World War II. That's the view of the Israelis and the Republicans that you just heard there. And that by withholding certain weapons and preventing the Israelis from conducting a full campaign in Rafah, you're only ensuring that Hamas sticks around and that this war will continue in perpetuity.
From the Hill, the FDA is preparing in case the current strain of avian flu circulating in the U.S. jumps to humans on a larger scale. FDA Commissioner R.F.K told the Senate on Wednesday that while the threat to humans is low and that the milk products are safe, the FDA and other agencies are working to scale up medical countermeasures. He says we have been busy getting prepared for if the virus does mutate in a way that jumps into humans on a larger level. Just what we need. Caleb said there is a possibility that H5N1 influenza virus could jump to humans and infect the lungs. And he said that would make it perhaps transmissible through the airways, which would be really bad.
Yeah, keep in mind, this is the FDA's job to prepare for this scenario. And we've been talking about H5N1 avian flu since the 90s. The concern there that it could jump to humans in a large scale way. That has not happened. And they don't think it'll happen this time either. Still, they're preparing. They do say that the public health risk is low here, but they don't want to be caught flat-footed. So as Eisenhower once said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Basically, you got to plan for various scenarios, is what Eisenhower was saying there, Jill. And that's what the FDA appears to be doing. Right now, the bird flu has gotten into cows. And the mortality rate for cows is only 1%. In fact, they don't even see symptoms in most of the cows. And that's one of the issues that they're having trouble tracking here is they're not testing enough cows. Not enough are having symptoms, but it's showing up in the milk. Now, again, pasteurization means that you're not getting avian flu. You're getting remnants of it in the milk. And they say that's totally fine. We've told you about, them testing meat for this as well. They don't seem to be concerned about that. The current bird flu strain has been seen in 36 dairy cattle herds across 9 states. But again, the feeling is that is much more widespread. But as far as humans are concerned, still that one case that we told you about, that's the farm worker in Texas who's very close to who is working very closely with cows. The only symptom for that person, pink eye, conjunctivitis. So again, the FDA doing its job before Congress saying, don't worry, we're getting ready for this, but we don't seem to be worried this go around. And Jill, we're still learning the lessons from COVID and previous pandemics.
From the New York Times, R.F.K. Jr. says that doctors found a dead worm in his brain. In 2010, R.F.K. Jr. was experiencing memory loss and mental fogginess, so severe that a friend grew concerned that he might have a brain tumor. Kennedy says he consulted with several of the country's top neurologists, many of whom concluded that he did have a tumor. He was actually scheduled for a procedure.
It's not a tumor.
What is that, Arnold Schwarzenegger?
That's Schwarzenegger and a kindergarten cop.
Kindergarten cop.
Yeah. It wasn't a tumor. It was a worm.
We can joke because it was not actually a tumor.
Correct.
Anyway, he was scheduled for a procedure at Duke University Medical Center by the same surgeon who had operated on his uncle, former Senator Ted Kennedy. But then he got a call from a doctor at New York Presbyterian Hospital who had a different opinion. Mr. Kennedy, he believed, had a dead parasite in his head. The doctor believed that the abnormality seen on his scans was caused by a worm that somehow got into his brain and ate a portion of it and then died. In the interview with The Times, Kennedy said he had recovered from the memory loss and fogginess and had no after effects from the parasite, which he said did not require treatment. What?
All I know is that the headline I saw that I had to double check, and it turned out to be true, is that Robert F. Kennedy says a worm was in his brain, ate part of it, and then died, and is still there. And that is, in fact, the truth here, folks. Asked last week if any of his health issues could compromise his fitness for the presidency, a spokesperson said that is hilarious, given the competition, basically saying I would take RFK's brain over Trump's brain or Biden's brain any day.
Yeah, he actually tweeted out, I offer to eat 5 more brain worms and still beat President Trump and President Biden in a debate. And then, I saw that on Yashar Ali's Instagram page, and he commented, How many hours do you think RFK Jr. and his team spent workshopping this brainworms content?
Jill, this sort of reminds me of the game show Fear Factor, which gave us Joe Rogan for the first time. Joe Rogan, who now has the biggest podcast in the world. That certainly would make the debate in the fall far more interesting if they all had to eat brainworms and then debate each other. Still, it appears here that Kennedy is confident that this was resolved 10 years ago. He's in robust physical and mental health. You've seen videos they've put out of Kennedy with his shirt off, surfing, doing push-ups, etc. in his early 70s as he faces competition in their late 70s and early 80s there with Trump and Biden. He believes, by the way, he contracted this parasite because he was traveling a lot in Africa, South America, and Asia as an environmental advocate, and somehow got the parasitic worm in his brain during that time. And so here we stand in May with a new revelation about RFK Jr. Jill, I know you've been digging further into this whole idea of a worm in your brain.
Yeah, I mean, you hear worm in brain and you just think, I think we need to know more. So some context here. There are about 2,000 hospitalizations for this condition each year in the U.S. That's according to the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases. Several infectious disease experts tell the New York Times that based on what Kennedy described, they think it was likely a pork tapeworm larva. To be clear, those doctors have not treated Kennedy. They were speaking in general terms. One professor of infectious disease said that microscopic tapeworm eggs are sticky and they are easily transferred from one person to another.
Yes, we're learning a lot of details about the way that the larvae work here, how they can get into your bloodstream, etc. The one doctor asked about this in the New York Times, says they believe it's unlikely that a parasite would actually eat part of the brain, that it would just sort of hang out in the brain and then die. And that's where you get inflammation, potential seizures, headaches, dizziness, etc., which appear to be some of the symptoms that RFK Jr. was suffering from. But just to reassure all of you, this is very rare. And it appears here that RFK Jr. says that he is fully recovered from this situation. Jill, I didn't have this on my 2024 election bingo card.
And finally, a story getting a ton of play on social media, including the mo.news Instagram account. Ohio State's commencement speaker for the class of 2024, entrepreneur and alum Chris Pan, says he took ayahuasca while he wrote his speech. Ayahuasca is a psychedelic hallucinogenic tea from South America. It's made by boiling a mixture of plants. His roughly 17-minute speech started by asking the audience of students, their families, and school leaders to sing part of the 90s song What's Up by Four Non-Blondes. Here is a bit of it.
The mechanics of investing are actually easy, but it comes down to mindset. The most common barriers are fear, laziness, and closed-mindedness. So I know this might feel polarizing, but I encourage you to keep an open mind right now. I see Bitcoin as a very misunderstood asset class. The early days, the exchanges for Bitcoin were prone to hacks and fraud, but the issue has been resolved with the recent launch of the Bitcoin ETFs backed by two of the world's largest asset managers, BlackRock and Fidelity.
At one point, he talked to the graduates about how cryptocurrency is misunderstood. You could actually hear some booing from the audience in the university's live stream. Needless to say, Moshe, you interviewed Pan on Instagram Live yesterday. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so he got a lot of attention for this, Jill, and it's so interesting because there's a group of people who are like, I loved how innovative you were and different. You were getting people to think differently about their future, etc. Then there's the traditionalists who are like, you've ruined my graduation. How could you ruin commencement with this sort of speech that's sort of out of left field? Then there's a lot of people, Jill, in the middle who sort of don't care. I asked you, actually, you're married to an Ohio State alum, what Michael thought of it.
And it was a big don't care.
But as we're talking about college graduation speeches, oftentimes you'll see, these inspirational speeches, these iconic speeches. Steve Jobs gave one. There's a few out there that are circulated and have hundreds of millions of views because of the way they inspire the next generation. And so I talked to Chris Pan, who's an Ohio State alum. He was invited. He's a motivational speaker, tech entrepreneur. And he was trying to do something different, like he does in his speeches that he gives to companies and people, where he makes it interactive, which is why he did the karaoke and had people sing along. He did say to me yesterday when I said, like, so the Bitcoin thing, and he's like, well, I didn't actually say buy Bitcoin. I just said it's misunderstood and people need to think differently about their financial health. But it sort of turned me into people's impression of it. I became a Bitcoin bro. And so what he said was actually over the weekend, he was planning to cut that part out. And the university's like, it's too late. We've already subtitled the entire thing. So please leave it in there. At this point,
you're stuck with the Bitcoin bit.
You're stuck with the Bitcoin bit. And I was like, see, you've been into Bitcoin for a while? He's like, no, I discovered it 3 months ago. I wish I was into Bitcoin. But like, he wanted to get the point that like your emotional health is important, your mental wellness is important, but also your financial health is important because of the anxiety, depression issues that financial health can create. So he was trying to hit various points in the speech. He does say, again, he's sort of still figuring out, like, I said, do you think it was successful? And he's like, well, I think that, TBD, depending on the haters. And even the IG Live that we did, Jill, there were people in it who were just like, pounding him one after another, being like, how could you? How could you? And he's, and then again, I said to him, I was like, I remember my commencement speeches that they happened. I don't remember what anybody said because they weren't very memorable. So, I think what he was going for was memorable. He was going to get people to set intentions, be forward-looking, etc. I think the delivery threw some people off. And then there was this, right? The fact that he took hallucinogens as he wrote the speech. He says he's been very into hallucinogens in recent years. Psilocybin, ayahuasca, etc. And so I asked him, Chris, how did that impact the speech? And here's what he said.
My speech wouldn't have been any different without the ayahuasca, to be frank, because, meditating and singing has been what I've been doing. Like if you look at my body of work, this is literally that. There's nothing that different. The thing that it gave me was a lot of courage, these journeys. It gave me the conviction and the courage to do it. Because, I'm scared too, because I'm like, what if they don't like me? What if they think I'm a clown, right? But I think the medicine really, it's a heart opener, and it really connects me to my heart, like my head to my heart.
So you heard there that he says that going on hallucinogens didn't actually impact the speech itself, like what he was going to say, but it gave him more certainty that what he was saying, it gave more confidence in what he was saying.
I guess my big takeaway is that it's nice that there's just a good old-fashioned commencement speech and a graduation. Kids work really hard, and this is the group that had been so impacted by COVID, and their high school graduations in many cases were canceled, and their freshman years were stuck behind masks or maybe virtual. So I think it's just nice to honor this class of graduates with an actual commencement.
Yeah, he had some good messages in our conversation yesterday about the need to learn tolerance and different perspectives and engage and be open-minded. A message that really is important these days at college campuses, given that what we've been seeing recently. I do think, though, that a bit of it was lost or overshadowed, I would say, by the Bitcoin bit. He conducts a magic trick at one point. He does singing. But it's interesting the way, again, that these commencement speeches really get people worked up in one way or another. And so we are in commencement season. Some, of course, are not happening. Many still are happening. And what we try every spring is that if there are impactful speeches or impactful lines, et cetera, we will make sure to incorporate them into podcasts in the coming weeks. All right. On this day, 500 plus years ago, Jill, we begin in 1502, May 9th, 1502. Christopher Columbus, you may have heard of him. He set sail for the fourth and final time, trying to find that passage to Asia. Remember, he had found some islands in what would turn out to be the Caribbean. But he still thought that if he just found a different way around those islands, that he could somehow make it to Asia. Of course, he would fail again. At that point, and for at least a few hundred more years, you had to go around South America to get to Asia. All right, on this date in 1960, the FDA approved the first birth control pill. It was actually decades in the making, conceived of 50 years previous, took a lot of research, released, approved on this day 64 years ago. All right, a little Richard Nixon history for you on this day. On this morning, 54 years ago, 1970, President Richard Nixon makes a surprise impromptu pre-dawn early morning visit to the Lincoln Memorial, where he chatted with a group of protesters who had been resting on the memorial steps to protest the Vietnam War at the time. Jill, interesting given the times we're living in today that you had the president himself go out and meet with protesters at the Lincoln Memorial.
I feel like if it wasn't for a security concern that I could potentially see Biden doing something like that.
Yeah, I mean, he actually, when people interrupt him at speeches recently where they're chanting Genocide Joe and take issue with his position in the Middle East right now, he says, let them talk, whereas Trump had a very different take with protesters where he's like, get them out, arrest them. Biden seems to like to engage with protesters, but again, given the security and optics, etc., you're not seeing much in the way of that right now. All right, a little horror movie history. I hated these films, Jill, but on this day in 1980, Friday the 13th, the horror film comes out for the first time and gave birth to many, many, many scary sequels.
I know you're not going to be surprised, but I'm not into them either.
We can agree on this item. Pass on the horror films. Why am I spending my time giving myself nightmares? We end here with a bit of music history. Jill, one of your options was right. Billy Joel celebrates a birthday today. He turned 75.
Happy birthday, Billy Joel.
Incidentally, also born this year, Bruce Springsteen. He celebrates his birthday. He'll turn 75 in September, but notably on this day, May 19th, 1974, a young 24-year-old Bruce was performing in Boston, and it was the first concert that a Rolling Stone magazine critic came to. He writes after seeing 24-year-old Bruce perform, "I have seen rock and roll's future, and his name is Bruce Springsteen."
And he was correct.
Yeah, see, you look at some reviews years later, and you're like, "Oh, they had it totally wrong." In this case, the critic, his name was John Landau, he actually would go on to become a manager for Springsteen in later years, seemed to get this one right. And a little TV history for you. On this day in 1992, 32 years ago today, we said goodbye to the Golden Girls. Final episode of the Golden Girls aired on NBC.
Thank you for being a friend.
I think you got the pitch there. You got the pitch there down.
I don't know if I did, but I have watched enough Golden Girls to get it. I really should have the pitch down. It's a great show.
It was a great show. Great theme song. Great characters. Iconic.
All right. Well, thank you all for being our friends, and thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. And we have a brand new podcast out on the Premium Pod right now with Neha Rush of Mother Untitled. You might follow her Instagram account about all things stay-at-home mom, redefining the pause from work and balancing the professional, the home life, the mental health, a lot of great tips over at Mother Untitled. So we talked to her ahead of Mother's Day over on the Mo News Premium podcast. If you're not a premium member, join today over at mo.news/premium, just $7 a month or $70 a year. All right. Bye, everyone.
Later.